The air in Ouagadougou was heavy, not from the heat, but from the weight of something larger. You could feel it in the silence that had swallowed the capital whole. Every street, every corridor of power, every eye in the region was focused on a single man and a single message that had yet to be answered. 3 days earlier, Ibrahim Traoré had stood before a summit hall that pulsed with a tension the world barely recognized. Cameras broadcast his face live to millions. He wasn't smiling, he didn't gesture. He simply stared into the lens as though it were the eye of history itself. His voice didn't rise, it didn't falter. It was steady, cold, clear. "Mr. Netanyahu," he said, "you have 72 hours. Not to apologize, not to debate, but to recognize." His words traveled farther than many expected. But in Tel Aviv, there was nothing. No statement, no press conference, no diplomatic overture. Just silence. Until the countdown hit 0. At 0 o'clock GMT, a black screen appeared on every television in Burkina Faso. No anthem, no graphics, no signal but static, then a flicker. And then Ibrahim Traoré. He wore no medals, no flag on his lapel. Just a plain uniform and a stare that didn't blink. Behind him, a single microphone, no entourage, no advisors. Just him. A man who had run out of patience. "The deadline is passed," he said. "And silence too is a choice. One that speaks louder than words." What followed wasn't a speech. It was a reckoning. He declared the freezing of every Israeli-linked contract within Burkina Faso. Defense, telecom, resource mining all terminated, not paused, not reviewed. Terminated. Then came the larger strike. He revealed a classified resolution, signed by 14 African leaders. A continent-wide alliance, independent of Western influence, created in less than 72 hours. A union based on respect, dignity, and mutual survival. And it was real. Already ratified, and last his voice nearly whispering, he called on every African nation to reevaluate diplomatic ties with any nation that did not respect Africa's sovereignty. He didn't mention Israel by name. He didn't have to. The next morning, the reaction began. In Dakar, protesters took to the streets, not in chaos but unity. In Lagos, the Nigerian Senate demanded an emergency session. In South Africa, the foreign minister called Traoré's message the most consequential African declaration of the decade. But it wasn't until a leaked Israeli intelligence memo reached global media that the full gravity set in. It read in part, "Burkina Faso's movement has triggered systemic risk across our African assets. This is no longer a bilateral issue. It is ideological, and it is spreading." Benjamin Netanyahu held a closed-door meeting with security and foreign policy advisors. No press were allowed. But what leaked was enough. An aide reportedly heard Netanyahu say, "He caught us flat-footed. We never thought he'd follow through." But Traoré didn't just follow through. He escalated. Within 48 hours of the broadcast, he personally flew to Addis Ababa. No red carpet, no limo. Just a convoy of military jeeps and a single demand. The African Union headquarters must host an emergency summit. They complied. There, Traoré addressed 39 nations. He brought no script, only a folder. Inside were satellite images, economic charts, and intelligence files. Evidence, he said, of external manipulation within Africa's institutions. Foreign money shaping African policy. He showed contracts, leaked documents, even private messages between lobbyists and key politicians. Then he turned the folder around and slid it across the table. "You may choose silence," he said, "or sovereignty." The room stayed silent, not in defiance, but in shock. By the end of the day, 11 more nations agreed to freeze or audit Israeli operations in their territories. 4 suspended embassies for review. And through it all, Traoré didn't posture. He didn't boast. He simply moved. When asked by a French journalist if this was a declaration of war, he replied, "This is not war. This is what happens when a continent decides it is no longer a pawn." In Washington, murmurs began. The Secretary of State scheduled an urgent call with Traoré. The EU offered to mediate, but Traoré declined both. He wasn't looking for a savior. He was building a mirror, one that the world now had to face. Israel issued its first official response 96 hours after the deadline. A vague statement about valuing African partnerships. It wasn't enough that the ground had already shifted. This wasn't about threats anymore. This was about precedent. A leader had drawn a line, and this time, the world didn't look away. The silence had broken, but not the tension. As the broadcast ended, the world entered a state of cautious alert. Every newsroom, every embassy, every boardroom began dissecting what just happened. Was this a symbolic move? Or was it the beginning of a new geopolitical alignment? Inside Jerusalem, Benjamin Netanyahu sat alone in his private chamber, the sound of distant sirens barely reaching through the reinforced windows. He wasn't speaking, just watching replaying Traoré's speech again. The stillness of his expression was deceptive. Behind his eyes, calculations were racing. Meanwhile, in Ouagadougou, Ibrahim Traoré didn't return to his residence. He walked into a dimly lit room where an emergency joint command meeting had just begun. Generals, foreign policy advisors, economic ministers. Everyone was present. The air was sharp with anticipation. "The line has been drawn," he said calmly. "Now we defend it. Not with violence, with vision." The first 12 hours saw African analysts dominating global headlines. From Lagos to Nairobi, scholars were called to explain the implications of Traoré's speech. It wasn't just about one country. It was about a shift in the gravitational center of global respect. Traoré had delivered a message far more powerful than missiles. Africa will no longer whisper. But Netanyahu wasn't idle. At dawn, a series of covert diplomatic calls were made. France, the UK, India, and even Brazil. Netanyahu wasn't asking for condemnation. He was asking for delay for quiet. He knew public backlash would only give Traoré more ground. But Traoré wasn't playing to Western diplomats anymore. In a stunning 8 a.m. press conference, the government of Namibia declared they were initiating a full audit of Israeli influence in their nation. It was followed by Ghana suspending joint military drills. Netanyahu blinked. Then came the unexpected. A direct call, one-on-one, Ibrahim Traoré and Benjamin Netanyahu. It wasn't broadcast. But what leaked hours later shifted everything. Netanyahu began with, "I underestimated you. I thought you were grandstanding. I see now I was wrong." Traoré's response, "This was never about ego. This was about dignity. We are not yours to ignore." There was no apology, no official statement. But within 24 hours, something extraordinary occurred. Israel announced it would participate in a regional dialogue with African leaders to address historical imbalances. No commitments were made, but the very act of acknowledgement was seismic. In Burkina Faso, Traoré returned to the people. Not through a palace speech, but by walking through the streets of Ouagadougou. No bulletproof vest, no entourage, just him. Talking, listening, embracing. The videos went viral. Not staged, not polished, real. One child asked him, "Why did you make them listen?" Traoré knelt and said, "Because we're worth listening to." Across Africa, murals appeared overnight. In Johannesburg, an 80-foot painting of Traoré with the words, "Deadline means dignity." In New York, African-American communities organized rallies, chanting his name. And in Tel Aviv, while protests broke out in disagreement, a surprising number of Israelis began to question their government's isolation tactics. Social media trended with #ListenToAfrica. But the moment wasn't just cultural. It became institutional. The African Union convened a special session. Traoré was invited not just to speak, but to lead. And for the first time in modern history, a continent moved not in reaction to tragedy, but in assertion of identity. And Netanyahu? He retreated from the cameras, choosing instead quiet recalibration, because he knew now the world wasn't watching him anymore. It was watching Ibrahim Traoré, watching a man who redefined diplomacy not with warheads, but with will. And in the silence that once tried to erase Africa's voice, a new sound echoed, a voice saying, "We are not the afterthought. We are the origin." So the question isn't whether Netanyahu will respond again. It's whether the world will continue pretending not to hear, because this isn't the end. It's only the beginning of a continent that refuses to be ignored. A deadline passed, and in its place, a new era began, with dignity, with unity. With Ibrahim Traoré,